Welcome to CX Exchange Success Hour. This is part of the industry series. This topic in particular, I'm really excited about. It is about companies that have hardware and they're adding software, or companies that have software that heavily relies on that tech stack, on the hardware. And I think it'll make a little more sense as we dig into it. But this is actually like the fastest growing area of tech and maybe even of our economy, although clean tech might have a rival there in terms of fastest growing. But it's really amazing to see kind of the impact that it's having. And so I'm going to just actually, what we usually do is I start to go through the slides and we have one other speaker who will go through and kick off the topic. But tonight, we're going to do it more like a fireside chat. And so and I forgot to pin the speakers, which of course I would do. But just if you stay on off mute, Josh, Ash, and Ty, then you'll stay near the top and then we'll always see you. But so we'll go ahead and go through and have some introductions. But what we're going to do is start off the conversation first with our folks who've been contributing to the resources here. Oh, wait, before I do that, let me just share with you what the heck I mean by the resources. So what all they've been doing behind the scenes is, oh, I need to introduce RevSetter too. Sorry, you can tell I'm on cold medicine, right? So we have not just an overview, but we have loads and loads of resources from each of our speakers here. And it's funny because we were trying to put together even more around this, but we find that things have not actually been written on the topic so much. And so if you do want to write a book or an article about this topic, we will feature you for sure. But we didn't have any in questions, but we should start to share those in Slack, I would say, as I start to have a conversation with myself about this. Okay, so moving on, what I wanted to share though is this whole industry series is really made possible from RevSetter. RevSetter is a CS platform that is AI native, and it's really an incredible group of folks, and it's been they really have made data a huge part of what they're able to share. I wish they were here to share. I'm going to try and be articulate on this, but what they're doing is making it much easier to surface what the priorities are, and all the data that shows kind of where your revenue opportunities are. They even have a way that you can share data and share materials with your customers, an interface. There's lots of great things about it. They do have a free to paid plan, and so you can even check them out for free, and it makes it pretty easy to use. So we really appreciate their partnership throughout the industry series, and they've really made it all possible. But go ahead and download the slides as we're discussing, and we will be talking through some of these things, but we're just not going to be looking at them specifically. So why don't we start off then? Josh, you are in the upper left-hand corner for me. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about kind of your relationship to this topic and kind of your history with it and what you've been doing. And
Yeah,
then we'll go
absolutely.
through with everyone. Yeah.
Sounds good. So, hey, everyone. I'm Josh Levin, based here in, well, not so sunny because it's late, Orange County, but usually sunny Orange County, California. I've been in CS for about 10 years, mostly with companies that would fit into the latter profile that Jen described of like software, but speaking to software professionals. So I think that's the kind of the way I've thought about the latter half is it's software companies because most of us work for software companies, but software companies who are catering to people who develop software, who are really ingrained in the software stack. Right now, I'm the senior manager of customer success at LaunchDarkly, which is a DevOps tool. And because I've spent so much time in this arena, I have fairly strong opinions that I'll try to keep, less spicy, like consumably spicy, about enabling CSMs to succeed in talking to their technical counterparts at their customers.
I love that. DevOps, definitely. And we can talk about even what DevOps is too. Well, maybe just share briefly, what do you mean by DevOps?
When I say DevOps, I mean the tools and processes needed for people to build software, like to build it locally, deploy it, and get it in front of us as users.
So DevOps being the developers, the people who are like the engineers who are building things. Great.
Exactly. Developers and teams that are adjacent to developers, like DevOps engineers, SREs, infrastructure people, that sort of thing.
Awesome. And Ash, why don't you go next?
Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm Ash. My background's actually in sales and account management, but a lot of the work that I actually did had a lot of customer success elements. And my first introduction into the hardware software space was when I started working at SoftChoice, which is a technology service provider. So I kind of had to help my clients in the commercial space with a lot of the challenges that you kind of experience in this hardware software space with like procurement, renewal, complex renewal contracts, and then procurement. I think I mentioned that. And kind of really great exposure to all the vendor partners, the channel partners that we had. And it's such a complex environment that inevitably clients actually come to providers like SoftChoice for help with things like software asset management and like trying to figure out how to move to the crowd, to the cloud, figuring out if they are even ready to do that. And then exposure to a lot of vendors like from Cisco, Veeam, VMware, NetApp, a whole bunch of different vendors that are in the hardware software space.
Great. And Ty?
Yeah, hey everyone, Ty Raia. So when Jan mentioned at the beginning that this is one of the fastest growing spaces, I'm kind of experiencing where we're seeing a lot of that, which is traditional companies who've maybe been around for 50, 80 years, primarily had hardware. They have a huge user base and their boards are saying, look, perpetual licenses aren't working for us anymore. We need that recurring revenue. And so they're starting to develop or get into software space. So that's why we're seeing such a big growth in it. And it's a really complicated space to work in terms of managing customers who have both hardware and software. So yeah, I'm really excited about today's talk.
And so what type of hardware or business model did you have that was then getting into the recurring business model, Ty?
Yeah, so I work for a OT cybersecurity company. We still sell hardware to this day. It's probably what keeps the lights on. And then we've started to move into some cloud offerings and software offerings as of maybe like 3-4 years ago. And those are certainly ramping up. So managing customers who have both extensive assets, both on the physical and virtual level.
And so that's really interesting because I don't usually think of security companies as being, like the hardware focus, right?
Sure.
Although was it more that they were on-prem or on the premises? And traditionally, is that kind of the
I mean, when you think security, to some degree, you do think hardware, right? Like think of all those server rooms, right, that have physical hardware, right? Like it's where the digital world's touching the physical world is where we have that security hardware, right? And just in the last, I would say, 10 years or so as an industry, we've started to see more cloud offerings. Cyber obviously is a little bit more cautious in moving into cloud environments, but it's definitely growing and for the right reasons.
That's really interesting. And so the other thing too is just for folks here, if you haven't thought about it, the cloud just means someone else's computer. Sorry, if you make me laugh, I'm gonna cough. I'm gonna try not to laugh. But but the other thing too, like when you hear about like John Deere and all of these other types of, things that, traditionally you think of like that's not tech, that's not in the cloud, that's not going to have subscription revenue, but in fact it does, because increasingly there's all kinds of things that are, being fed into even tractors, right? And if you think about, even cars or anything like that, just like cars have all kinds of tech in them, and now tractors do too, and so they're even sharing like weather and whatever, all kinds of stuff, right? And in that respect then they're trying to get those recurring plans, and so even John Deere has a subscription plan that's going on, right? And so that I remember reading about how they're even starting to hire customer success managers, right? And trying to think about, and it's changing their whole model, right? But Ash, what one of the ones that we were talking about earlier was like Cisco, and I know there's some folks who were formerly from Cisco, right? So what kinds of things were you, how would you compare like Cisco and how it fits in the ecosystem?
From my experience, like companies like Cisco or Fortinet, in the security space, you'll have clients that have the hardware deployed in their environment, and then you also have the served software that that goes along with it to track all the products, to see that those are like, let's say for example, Fortinet, you'll have like these firewalls, physical firewalls that are in a customer's environment, but then along with that, you have the software that's there to support all those physical assets, and then also to track those assets, if that answers your question.
Yeah. And Paul and Steve, did you want to add anything to that, since I know you've built whole businesses off of Cisco?
Oh, I'm sure Steve wants to say something.
Okay.
Go for it, Paul.
Okay, one of you
I
start.
mean, I think since we're talking about definitions here, I mean, I'll just concur with what Ash said, and I would say increasingly so. In fact, it's interesting to see, big behemoths like Cisco or HP, which is now also Aruba and Juniper all combined, and Arista and Fortinet. Their space, which has been predominantly hardware driven, is increasingly software license driven now. I worked at Cisco over 10 years ago, and for about 15 years. And it was round about that time that the executives of Cisco were announcing to the market that they were going to be a software company. And sure enough, today, they're far more software revenue than they have hardware revenue. Hardware is really just a commodity, and they've acknowledged it. They've kind of thrown in the towel on that, but increased their portfolio of software, and of course, commensurately increase their customer success organization. They had overblown it so much, and Steve, I know, has opinions on this, but they overblown this so much. They had over 2,000 customer success employees at one point. That organization has recently been somewhat disbanded, right? But now we're seeing the emergence of that entire space as a service. So there are companies now that are born in the cloud that are offering what was formerly only hardware centric as a service. But guess what? They're sending hardware out to the site. Just like Ty said, I love the analogy you said. It's where the cloud meets the premise, right? And that's where you're seeing all that hardware getting stacked in increasingly large amounts.
Josh, you're adding a lot over in the chat. Let's hear more from you on this topic. You're talking about hardware manufacturing becoming more efficient and cheaper. Why don't you share?
Just piggybacking off of what Paul was saying, just totally agree with Paul that it's harder and harder nowadays to become a pure hardware selling company, because hardware, especially when it comes to to servers, chips, the things that are the backbone of the internet and what we use, it's becoming more and more efficient, as it should be. That's science. But because it's becoming more and more efficient and cheaper and cheaper to make and manufacture these parts, it's harder to commoditize that and have like a sustainable business purely just on hardware. That's one of the reasons why software is becoming such a relevant thing, and everyone's becoming a software company because they have to be to survive.
Interesting. Aisha.
Yeah, I had a question. I think we touched on it earlier. I'm curious, for companies that deal in like IT management, IT asset management, and endpoint management on-prem, what are the challenges of moving to the cloud? I know everybody's moving there, but what are those challenges, both from if I'm the organization and I want to move to the cloud and I'm a company providing on-prem IT, management endpoint services, but have clients moving to the cloud, how do I pivot?
That's definitely a big question. Because
Any take?
lots of things involved in pivoting, right?
Yeah.
Ty, do you want to take it?
I was going to say, like, yeah, I think that's a bespoke answer. Like, you would have to look at that particular model to find the right way forward. But yeah, I don't think there's any board that's not looking at that for any traditional perpetual company. So I would look specifically at that company. I'd be happy to meet with you and like look at a said company.
But just generally, some of the things you would look at though is you would need to take a look at what your business model is, and we'll start talking about business models, right? But then also, if you do decide how you're going to change that business model, then there's a whole rollout plan, that you would need to do. So you would need to change your marketing, you would need to change your sales process, you would need to change all of your communication to your current customers, right? And so that is a huge process and plan of a rollout. And whether you start to do some with pilots or how you roll that out, there's a lot involved in it. All right.
Yeah, it could be everything from being recurring revenue to like post-sales services, to PS services. It can also be software. So it's not limited to just creating software as a recurring revenue. There are definitely other avenues depending on the company.
So, and it might be more clear as we dig into this more. Fran, did you have a question? Oh, sorry, Josh.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry to interrupt, Brandon. Sorry to interrupt, Jen. Just add real quick to what Ty is saying. Again, totally agree with Ty, and like how I've seen this impact the roles that these companies employ for CS. For folks that are for companies that are very on-prem heavy, you'll see a lot of like titles going from like field engineer or like in-place technical account manager to more CSM style roles, because to get information about how people are leveraging the tool doesn't require you to be in their warehouse with them, in the tool with them. You can be here in the comfort of your in my case, my studio apartment, and see how they're using the tool from the cloud itself. So it changes the engagement model pretty heavily and the expectations for the CS professional and how they engage. Sorry to interrupt, Fran.
No, I love that addition to it. Fran, what was your question?
Yeah, it was more sort of a thought that I wanted to share, because my last company, actually my last two companies, had hardware and software, but especially Sitecore, they were actually introducing cloud versions and ended up laying off 3/4 of the CSM team while I was there. But what was really interesting is that one of the reasons that we were hoping more customers would move to the cloud is because the customers that were on-prem, we couldn't get any data from them. So we had no idea what the impact of the solution was. So you're just meeting and sort of talking about what you can, usage data and things like that, some of it, but it was really much harder for those on-prem customers for us to really let them know what the impact was, because we had no visibility into it. And so I think as more companies move to the cloud and off of on-prem, they're going to be able to sell their value proposition more effectively if the solution works.
Yeah, definitely. So let's dig into the business models here and talk about that a little bit. Ash, why don't you start here talking about the types of business models that you saw from your perspective in when you were working specifically in this area, and how much of it was, like what were the contracts like? Did you have annual, multi-year? Did you have or just like one-time purchases and also additional products? Like what kinds of challenges and how did it, was everyone on the same type of contract?
Yeah. So because I was in the commercial and enterprise space, most of my clients were hybrid, moving to the cloud, but still wanted to keep on-prem, especially depending on the kind of data that they have. If it's like super sensitive data, they want to keep it on-prem. So a lot of them stayed hybrid. So a lot of like their contracts, depending on what software application that they had or the nature of the product that they had in their environment. All in all, like with Softchoice and the relationship or the nature of my relationship with my clients is like we were the people who handled a lot of their renewals and a lot of their contracts across all of their vendors, almost all of the vendors that they had in their environment in one specific company. So there would be a lot of complexity, especially associated with their hardware and software products. Like they might have servers deployed out and they have software associated or other types of product, and the renewal times might be completely different per asset. So you might have like I had a client who had a NetApp, and I had to manage renewals every month for different assets and track all of them, and then work with our technical resources to make sure that the contracts are correct. And I remember when we were discussing this, even Ty had mentioned something about bundles and unbundling. And I had to also work. And one of the things that clients really liked is if we could actually if we had different renewal dates for at least one product, and we could actually like change it out to just be one renewal date instead of multiple for the same product. That was like a major value add. Something as simple as doing that really was a major value add because it's such a complex environment. And then the other aspect was hardware procurement, and the logistics is quite complex, which is why a lot of clients kind of used companies like Softchoice to help with that logistics. And I worked at Softchoice during the pandemic, so that was all the hardware constraints was just more
challenging then.
Insane. Yeah.
Wow.
It actually maybe helped me sell hardware more because of the challenges associated with that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, just thinking about the complexities. Ty, you mentioned in our prep a term that I hadn't heard before, and that was CPQ. Why don't you just share something about that and some of what we were talking about with that?
Yeah, so what I was saying, so CPQs are basically that system, like systems that set up your quoting, right? When you have CPQ in place, real simple. When you don't have CPQ in place, you could have literally hundreds of thousands of individual SKUs. Some of those are bundles, some of those are individual. So being able to manage with software, usually not that bad. If you add hardware on there, it starts getting really complicated. So for me, before we had a CPQ, I had to create logic using a company called DataSieve over all of those SKUs to make sense of it, right? To make it readable so I could understand what a customer even had. So each customer might have 2,000 different SKUs, but what does that actually mean in terms of human language, right? How many servers do they have? Right?
Yeah, that is definitely SKU heavy. And as Josh was mentioning in the chat, CPQ stands for configure pricing quote. And because of that, if you don't then consolidate to one renewal, then you literally, instead of, always be curious or any of those other things, you're always be renewing, right? Like you're just constantly renewing.
Yeah.
That's kind of crazy. Aisha, you had a question?
Yeah. So this might be a basic question, and I don't know if we're going to cover it, but as we hear about AI and how much physical data centers are required and how much it consumes, how is that going to change the hardware sort of software relationship, or is it? Sorry, it's a basic question, but just one that I keep hearing that, all these data centers that are required, power that's required, energy that's required for consumption by all of these up and AI companies.
Does someone have thoughts on that?
Yeah. Go ahead, Josh. You first.
Oh, so I don't have a great answer, to be honest, because I think it's a kind of it's a tough question. So it's a great question, Aisha. I will say that with people leaning more and more onto AI, which is basically code for them, or basically them saying subtly, we're relying on someone else's code, someone else's servers to make decisions for us. I think it's just another example of the world moving more and more towards cloud, towards more and more towards software instead of on-prem hardware. So I think it's less a driving force for something, but more representation and a reflection of how the world is kind of shifting its focus more and more towards cloud native, less on-prem stuff and that sort of thing. But sorry, Paul, continue your thought.
No, actually, surprisingly, I was going to say something very similar, and I agree. I mean, I think it's you touched on the power considerations, Aisha, and that's something that I think it's going to be hard to get away from. You're starting to see more of a utility type style approach to basic infrastructure requirements. But even as you do that, you still have physical hardware. They're just, managed, and configuration is managed. And it's a little bit different than like the traditional managed service, because, it is truly like, this is the infrastructure as a service. But you still have to power it somewhere. So you still have the power considerations.
Yeah, exactly.
I think though, that the more I think it was you who asked, or somebody asked earlier about how you migrate to the cloud.
Yeah.
I think the question really is, why migrate to the cloud? So you've got to first start looking at what it is, what are the business requirements first. I think you were starting to lean in that direction, Jan. What are the business requirements? What is the organization trying to accomplish? And will cloud and a reduction of your workforce managing solutions be something that is going to be necessary for you in the future? Core versus context. Like, what are the things that you can start to outsource? It's kind of the same question that we're facing with AI considerations, right? So, I mean, so many organizations are approaching us and saying, help us figure out our AI strategy. It's like, well, it's not really an AI strategy. It's what's your business strategy, and can you automate things to help you do that? Same thing with cloud. Can you outsource or outtask or outmove some of these assets so that you don't have to manage them yourself? It's just a methodology for solving problems.
To add on to that, totally agree with Paul. On kind of the other side of that coin, right? There's also what can I get to consumers faster? So in cybersecurity, with 0 days doubling year over year, right? I want to be able to get that information to them as soon as it's available. When you're all on-prem, that's you manually downloading something, usually in quarterly cycles, versus I have it to you the minute it's available. So it's adding that extra layer of security and speed.
Right. Let's also talk about then, in terms of as a CSM, now that we kind of have an idea of kind of what all this area is and the complexities to it, the different types of business models, how complex the contracts might be, where you might have, several different types of products that are on, different stages and different timing. What challenges with on-prem and lack of data, right? As a CSM, and dealing with your various sort of stakeholders, personas, and these different challenges, what kinds of things do you encounter? Where do you find it easiest to address these challenges? And I sort of went over very broadly, but Ash, if you want to maybe kick off, what any of the thoughts that sort of came in when I was giving that very long-winded question.
Yeah, I think it's really because of like the complexity of it, it's really important to have established relationships with like the stakeholders within a business and have like a strategic relationship with them where you're a trusted advisor. A lot of the times, even if you're not the smartest person in the in the meeting or whatever, and your clients and the stakeholders within your client's business that you have relationships with are like CIOs or CISOs and whatnot, and they have way more technical experience with you, but like you can come in from understanding the business side of things and starting to be curious about the strategy that they have. And so like things like if we're like, let's say, for example, we have a challenge of moving subscriptions from on-prem to the cloud. One of the questions that would be critical is to understand what their when their financial year is and when their budget allocations, when they start deciding those things and discussing how they can move from CapEx to OpEx, because if they have to start spending money on a subscription because of the move that they have to make, that's a relevant conversation to have with them. And so that's kind of the approach and the strategy that we definitely took at SoftChoice, is building that strategic relationship, and then also kind of bringing in the elements of showing them their environment and doing the software asset management and hardware asset management and planning those conversations, not 30, 60, 90, but even like 6 months ahead or even a year ahead, and doing PRs so that we can have those constant conversations with different stakeholders.
Right. Stakeholders then, Josh, were you going to share on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say some of the challenges. I'll actually present a little bit of a different side than Ash just did. They're both obviously perfectly relevant, but some of the challenges that I've seen specifically on the software side, I think it applies to both hardware and software, but I can only speak for software, is because the people, our stakeholders, our champions, the people that are going to get our contracts renewed are developers. They're not procurement people. They're not VPs of IT. They're people in code building things. The natural challenge that I've seen in a bunch of companies I've worked with is getting the CSM to be able to talk shop with someone that is building software. Like if a CSM goes into a conversation with the developer and says, "Hey, let me upsell you on this product that I have a very service level understanding of," and not be able to connect it back to their business outcomes, which for a developer are like speed of delivery, low latency, like avoiding errors that impact revenue, like things that matter to software engineers, it's not going to make any sense. So CSMs really struggle across the board in software in these industries to really connect with their users. And then at that point, they basically just become glorified salespeople, which no insult to people from sales. Like I love you all, but like there's no differentiation there for CSM. And then everything that falls out from there.
All right. Ty, any other challenges or stakeholders you would mention?
I mean, I feel like people have mentioned the stakeholders really well. I would say challenges. Traditionally, if people have been on-prem, moving them to something where they're more visible and more exposed can be a challenge. Like that's more of an emotional challenge that you usually have to get people through. But really pivoting as to the why it's so beneficial to them. The other is using it as a way to manage annual costs versus, hey, you just paid for this once, now I'm asking you to pay for it every year. Having predictability around those costs versus having it basically spike every 5 to 10 years. So I would say those are the two big challenges I run up to moving people over and kind of how I look at them.
Right. So we do have some questions for the breakout session. And was there anything else before we go? Because we are kind of running a little late to it. But is there any other thoughts or questions that folks have here before we go? Chetna, I have a feeling you work in this area. Were there was there things that you were thinking of?
Yes, yes. So I have been a part of Cisco and VMware both at the time when they were making the move from full hardware to subscription based, model. And I have been the transformation architect for both of the companies for different initiatives, especially the services migration for Cisco, and for VMware, I was their cloud customer success architect, the global architect, for all the 5 years that VMware had customer success, last 5 years. Now, I mean, it's already acquired by Broadcom, and that's a different part. But then, yeah, I mean, so I had a lot of experience and all the points that we were discussing on config price code, and how sometimes there can be some products where there is a dependency on the hardware component being first shipped, even though you are going to have the pricing model, let's say mostly on the subscription based, but still there is a dependency on the hardware model. Like two of the prominent products were Bello Cloud that VMware acquired that needed a equipment to be kind of shipped before we could do something. And then other was Dell, when we were like working with the Dell to have VMware software installed on Dell. So first the Dell equipment has to reach, and only then VMware can be installed on that. So again, there is a dependency, even though it's a subscription based. So that kind of, yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. Okay, well, why don't we just have a short conversation in the breakout rooms? I know some folks have to go, but let's I'll go ahead and we'll just have a short conversation in the breakout room, so that if you have more questions, you can share some information. And let's see, do I have them open? It looks like you can see it. Okay, great.
And we're back.
Hey, so what kinds of things are going on? I always feel like FOMO. I can see everyone talking over there.
Well,
what's your
Paul blew
insights?
my mind because I'm originally from the Northern Virginia area in Ashburn. And if you guys know anything, that's like the hub of data centers. I was just telling him every time I go back home, it's like another complex of data centers that's just coming up, right? And I was wondering if AI, obviously, as we know, it needs a lot of processors and all that. That was my question, So he said, yeah, it's been going on for 10 years. They've even used container ships as data centers, which I didn't know. So that was pretty interesting to hear, how these data centers, even with cloud, it's still like I think Ty said, it's still someone else's computer, still some hardware that has to reside somewhere. So I'll kind of
Look at this, Aisha. Containerized data centers. Look at this. Google has a floating data center, a 4-story data center on a ship in San Francisco Bay.
Underwater. Oh wow.
Microsoft has an underwater data center. I mean, yeah, I mean they're doing all. It's just more and more and more.
Interesting.
Oh my
like
gosh,
you said,
share that.
Soon it'll be
Share
Mars.
that in the chat.
Yeah,
That's
I
All
all
I did was Google data centers on container ships, and that's what came up.
Data
actually,
centers on containers.
remember finding that out about like the data centers being in the water, because it's actually cheaper, because it's easier to cool them down when they're underwater, and so you don't actually
Right.
spend cooling them down.
I don't
Wow.
know. Logistically, I don't know how that'd be cheaper, but very interesting.
And that's funny enough, that goes back to your earlier question, Aisha, about power and other like basic requirements of a data center. And so that's what they figured out, like what Ash just said, is, cooling and some elements of powering, hydroelectric power can be pulled into play, wind and solar.
Right. Think about that. That gets over into clean energy, Kathy.
Yeah.
So
There you go. It's all connected at the end of the day.
yeah. What other kinds of things came up in the discussion groups?
I think we had some good light bulb moments for Lindsay in areas to look at. That's both stuff that's hardware that's probably moving into the software space or has little bits, and starting to look at that as a place to maybe do some growth.
Can you say more about that? Either you or Lindsay?
Lindsay, do you want to share?
Oh yeah, sure. My background's mostly in like nonprofit, but direct client services and relationship building with various companies. But on the creative side, so originally my job search was really focused on that, on like fundraising companies. But I'm also a quilter. And so right now, a lot of like the longer machines are hardware based. These big machines, they have all the software built in. And, light bulb moment for me to reach out to companies about them transitioning to more software subscription based. Especially they have a lot of like shows you can go to as well. So connecting with people that way as well that are selling the hardware at these quilting shows. So we had a nice little discussion about looking into that.
Quilting. Who would have thunk that? Even quilting is connected to this whole hardware software migration. Wow.
Again, think any traditional hardware company, right? We're all moving there somewhere.
Interesting. What other things came up that we should be sure to share?
I think one interesting topic towards the end that came up in our conversation was the enablement can be quite challenging because things can be quite challenging, the content and the expectations for a CSM. How technical do you need to be? And I think also Chetna was saying, maybe I'll let you talk about what you were saying, Chetna.
Sure. So I was just sharing my experience with respect to role rationalization. So a lot of times when the customer success is either formed or is trying to expand or deepen the foothold, there comes a question of how much is the actual value that CS adds versus roles like technical account manager, or the enterprise architects, which are more kind of closer to the product. So when push comes to shove, when it's about implementation discussions beyond or in the same meetings where we are also discussing the customer success planning. So sometimes the CSMs, fumble because they are really not very close to the actual talk track of the product. So in VMware, we used to always, based on the customer segment, we would mostly engage our technical architects or enterprise architects with those customers in the success planning discussions. But there was at least 2 times that leadership wanted to do role rationalization. And there was a lot of jobs that were really impacted because the races were compared. I was personally involved in that. So I really know like how you compare all of the titles and what is their expected job duties, and then start striking and say, okay, 40 people impacted in this org, 20 people here, and then you come up with your revised capacity planning and segmentation planning and allocation. It's a very tedious exercise, but that happens sometimes just because of the enablement differences as well as expectations. So when we moved to Broadcom, that happened at a massive scale, and then they really wanted the professional services to step up.
Yeah.
Because that was really fairly paid type of technical services we were already giving. And they're like, okay, we'll just make the CA success planning a small part of it. Just let the professional services lead the show. But still they wanted to tag CS. So we still have success planning,
Right.
But it's mostly professional service.
Well, and Ash, weren't you saying that it took you 3 months of training before you started on your role?
Yeah. We had like 3 months of training before we were even like deployed on a team.
Yeah.
And I think that's like a really important aspect for CSMs looking to get into the space, actually like looking at how much enablement like a company actually provides is like something that's, I think, quite critical. There are a lot of these companies that offer like certifications. So you can do that beforehand. It's actually a great way to even put yourself, like you give yourself an advantage if you're looking for a role in this space. And
Wow.
and if it's a good
Go ahead
indicator.
and get like a certification in it.
Yeah, like you can get Cisco certification, you can get VMware certification and all of that.
Yeah. Josh, did you have something to share?
Yeah, I was just going to add on to what Chetna is saying, that I feel like a lot of tech companies, and I won't even say just startups, like startups and a lot of big companies, too big conglomerates, where they get this wrong is they'll just look at a customer as a static thing and say, oh, a customer needs a salesperson, some kind of a CS person, and some kind of a technical person, and et cetera, et cetera. But they're not remembering that the customer is extremely dynamic. Like in a customer in onboarding, very much will need someone technical to implement them. But that customer is going to look a lot different in 3 or 6 months when they've actually gone that first time to first value, and they're just adopting and just trying to get in the hands of the right people. And that motion looks a hell of a lot different than onboarding implementation does. And there's this cycle, especially with large companies, where they do layoffs of one broad group of people, and the other group of people have to absorb that job responsibility. And later they'll realize, oh, whoopsie daisy, we swung the pendulum too far, and they'll do a layoff of another subset of people, and then another group will have to absorb responsibility, when they just need to appreciate that the customer lifecycle is complex and it changes as software changes.
Interesting. Love that. See a lot of nodding heads. Jill, I saw your head nodding early on in this conversation. Was there something you wanted to add in?
No, I was telling, I didn't even know what I was getting into when I got into this session. And then once everybody started talking, I realized, oh, I have experience in that. I worked for a company up in San Jose that worked with cities and counties, governments, and school districts. And they were installing things like security cameras, data closets, networking, and all that kind of thing. And so I remember working with these CPQs and getting the quotes, and then they'd let me know that they were wrong. They didn't put the right software with the hardware, and they'd have to go back and they'd have to reprice it after we'd already put out the quote to the customer. And it was just a nightmare. And I said, these aren't the people who are doing the customer success, right? And I don't ever remember working with anyone in customer success. And these guys are like, yeah, no, they don't have it, because Cisco was an absolute nightmare. And people just wanted to get out of that because it was expensive and it was confusing and just miserable. So I can't even imagine what customer success looks like in that field, because I never worked with anyone in customer success. All I worked with was the technical people. And we were always knocking our heads against the wall going, I don't understand why this is so hard. We can't take care of our customer because the company isn't taking care of us.
I'll add to that real quick in that, and I know this is somewhat controversial. I know we like to make CSMs always really proactive with the customer. With a lot of these really big enterprise customers, a lot of what you're doing is like concierge, white glove, helping through the red tape and complications of both their org and your org. And I think we often dismiss that as that's not CS work. CS work is only fill in the blank. Well, what if the company I work with is totally saturated, which they often are. There's nothing to grow to. They just grow year over year without any work on my part. What they want is someone to walk them through all of that. And I think we see that more commonly in those really big enterprise spaces.
Interesting. Paul, I know that you've had some thoughts around channel partners and CS and CSMs. You want to maybe share some of your thoughts on that?
Actually, yeah, I do have quite a bit of experience from having met a lot of people there. But frankly, I think Ash really covered a lot of it, because she lived and worked in that space, right? Soft Choice is an exact model of the type of company that I talk about sometimes, that brings in many different solutions for an individual customer at scale across many different customers, right? That's the value-added reseller or the technology solution provider. There are tens of thousands of these companies worldwide. Soft Choice is definitely one of the bigger ones and more accomplished ones, and they focus more on software, but also does a lot of hardware. Delivering customer success in that kind of a world is really difficult, because the customers are relying on you, but the manufacturer each of the manufacturers wants to deliver their own layer of customer success as well. So managing the customer's expectation, but also your partner's expectation, so that you and your sales team's expectations, so that you could drive that transformation for your customer's business forward is a real challenge, right? And so I love, Ash, your perspective on that, and some of the comments that you made earlier, really insightful. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Awesome. All right. Any other thoughts to share while we're over time now, which is kind of surprising that we're over time.
I don't think anybody
When we
wants to go
have
back
this whole
to
drama
reality.
of the vote, happening outside of our world, but out of this world. But any other thoughts to share? Mackenzie, I know that you had you were speaking a lot in the breakout room. Was there anything else you wanted to share on? We haven't heard from you tonight.
Oh, no, I was just, one thing I was saying was I'm excited to see you tomorrow up here in LA.
Yeah,
at the event. No, and then we were just talking about our different, we're kind of ping-ponging different resources off of each other of different places to kind of network and look for other opportunities, since most of us were in that space right now.
All right. Well, cool. I just wanted to be sure that, we have a more intimate group tonight, and so many people did get to share. Eric, was there anything that you wanted to ask or share before?
No, but thank you, Jen, and thanks to all the presenters. I was happy to be quiet tonight and soak up all the info that was shared. So appreciate you all for logging in and helping loop in the rest of us here.
Awesome. Well, great. We can continue this conversation. I have the throat lozenge. We can continue this conversation in the Slack channel. It's hashtag IND-hardware-software. And if you just go to the top of the channels and do the down arrow, that's how you can go and add channels. So if you're not in it yet, please do. I'd love for you to continue the conversation. And that's why we're here doing it, is so that we can start to bring people together, both with for folks who might have challenges working in the space and want to share thoughts or ideas, or folks who want to network and get into the space. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Jen. Hope you feel better.
Yeah, Jen.
Yeah.
I just said to try some hot water with ginger and honey. That's
Definitely.
Yeah.
Will do.
All right,
Thank you
guys.
so much.
Great content, all. Thanks.
Enjoyed
Thank
it.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of Success Hour, formerly known as CS Office Hours. We regularly put out new content, so to be the first to know, like this episode, tap that notification bell, hit that subscribe button, and we look forward to seeing you soon.